Okay, we're
Okay,
on.
fine. Okay, wait a minute here. Okay, very good. Shall I take it away?
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, thank you. Very good afternoon, everyone there in Indiana and wherever else you might be. I'll be talking about receivers, and if you have any questions at the end about transmitter issues, you can ask that. But one thing I want to mention, even though we're going to talk about radios, focus on your antenna if possible. There's nothing like directivity to reduce QRM. Gain's good, of course, but the directivity from a 3 or 4 element Yagi is just astounding. Yes, did that slide switch okay on your end?
The slide. Yeah.
Okay, one time I had an issue with that, so great. Okay, so are you considering a new rig? So whether a new rig or the one you've got, I'm going to talk a bit about optimizing what you've got or what you might have in the future. And something that's fairly new here with these direct sampling transceivers, the net receiver gain, understand how they're so different when you use a preamp, when you use an attenuator. A lot of people don't ever use an attenuator, and on the lower bands with many radios, that's advisable. And it's amazing what we can buy today at the prices of $1,600 or less. The 7300, of course, that's been out now for like, what, 6 or 7 years, and they've sold like 50,000 of them in the US and Canada. FTDX10's a couple years old. The FT710 really about a year old. And the 590 SG is still around, and the little 705 is kind of a specialty rig, but again, they're under the $600 price range. Now, I've been publishing lab measurements since 1976, I guess. And of course, now it's up on the web. It used to be printed. And we can weed out radios that probably aren't a good choice. But really, we want to know, how's it work on the air? And how's it work for you? It may not be the same. What works for you may not work for me. And if you're locked into one brand, we're lucky now that all the major OEMs have quite a product that's, from a testing standpoint, are quite good. So my website is sorted by dynamic range. And dynamic range simply means at what point does your radio start producing interference? And the way it was defined way back in 1975 in QST and Ham Radio Magazine, if the distortion product, this is the case, the third order distortion product, just like if we looked at a linear amplifier with its third order distortion product, once it equaled the noise floor, that's just the definition. It's also called spurious-free dynamic range because the spurious is at the noise floor and insignificant. And then there's this new concept, because so many of the radios, particularly once we got synthesized radios, the synthesizers weren't very clean, so the radio might be limited by the synthesizer. So by 2012, the league came up with a term, reciprocal mixing dynamic range, in addition to third order dynamic range. And that was really how clean the local oscillator is, or now with direct sampling radios, the clock. So that's kind of a relatively new concept, well, approaching 9 years ago, I guess, or 11 years ago. So for the long time, we had up conversion radios after the type of like a Drake and a Collins that had a pre-selector and a low frequency IF. And so we had radios that covered up through 10 meters or 6 meters, had a wide first IF, and those were not really optimum for CW contesting, RTTY contesting, because the dynamic range was only about 70 dB, and that's really not adequate for a pile up, CQ worldwide or something like that. But then the Orion came along, and the K3, and then the modern radios that went back to the low IF that we had in the old days. And now we've got direct sampling radios that have dynamic ranges in the 100 dB range, plus or minus 5. So 20 years ago, you couldn't buy a radio that could handle that big a difference between strong signals that you don't want to hear and a weak signal that you're trying to copy. So what's a superhet roofing filter do? Well, if it's wide, you've got a much more chance there are going to be strong signals in there causing overload of the radio. But as that went back to the low IFs, like 5 megahertz, 9 megahertz, 11 megahertz, if it was narrow enough, almost all the signals on the band didn't get through the roofing filter that could cause some type of overload. And what if you say, well, what if there's two signals that you don't want to hear in a 500 hertz roofing filter And of course, you've got your DSP set to maybe 100 hertz. In that case, key clicks are probably going to be the limit. So it isn't be a practical problem if we've got multiple signals in a relatively narrow roofing filter. On sideband, the reason we really got away with these up conversion radios that were 70 dB at best was on sideband, the splatter 2, 3, 4, 5 kilohertz away is worse than the dynamic range of all those radios. So that's how we lived with them until they're basically gone. I think the IC 7851 is the only remaining current product that's really an up conversion radio. So here's some information off my website. I've got like 150 different radios, some receivers, because back in the old days we just had transmitters and receivers, and a few receivers for SWLs, but 150 radios on this website. And this is the top 25 individual models. Now, because there's multiple listings for a K3, there's a K3 and a K3S, and then the direct sampling radios are a little more inconsistent because each ADC chip, analog to digital converter chip, is different. So there's multiple listings for an individual model at times. So this is the top 25 models. And of those 25, I've run 20 of them in contests over the last 20 years, and particularly in the last 16 at my contest station where I am today. So you can see it's just astounding. You look right there in the middle. You got 99 or 100 dB radios that, like I say, you couldn't buy in the past. It was a dream. So how do you select a new radio? Well, I'd say start with the top 25. But if you say, well, I've been a Yaesu operator, owner, or a Kenwood or whatever forever, you've got a good model you can pick because they all have something that's really there in the top range. The price range is all over the map. And matter of fact, just after the last few days, one of them's even below $1,000. So $1,000 and up, of course, the sky's the limit there in a couple of different ones. One thing that you might want to have to pay attention to is how can you mitigate noise like line noise, or just the urban noise is a problem, and it's certainly gotten worse over the last 50 years. Let me talk about antennas again just real briefly. What's my list of importance if you're really a DXer? Location. Now, maybe you can't change that, but I did. I'm out here in the country now. Your antenna, absolutely. Put up the best directive antenna you can, or if it's like in the low bands, if possible, a directive array of verticals. Your operator skill. For a contester, the skill, that's certainly not me. My CW skill isn't what it was when I was 18 years old. And then the model radio, because really the other things, if you're going to spend the first $100 on something, look at your antenna if you can make that better. So here's this strange thing with these newest radios. They're all direct sampling, which means rather than being a super het, they've got an analog to digital converter chip. And all those chips have inadequate noise floor if that's all you had. So here's the 6 of the common direct sampling radios, and look over on the right, the dynamic range is pretty much the same. You'd never notice a difference on the air. They're all around 100, which is more than you'd probably need. But look at the noise floor differences with no preamp turned on. Now this is a design decision, and that's not right or wrong. They're just very different. So the 6600 there at 111, I'm going to need a preamp to work weak stuff on 20 meters. Or if I've got the ICOM, I'm never going to run a preamp on 20 meters. So you just need to know what your radio is and how it's designed with the preamp off. Of course, they've all got preamps. So in the case of the Flex, you can turn on lots of preamp gain, which you don't need as much with the ICOM. Matter of fact, on the ICOM, you probably want to run attenuation on 80 meters, 160 for sure, and probably even 40. So it's just a difference, but one thing we're going to talk about is receiver noise gain to let you know when do I need a preamp. And just to say, well, let's just turn the preamp on, that's not the way to do it. So in a little bit, I'll mention antenna noise gain and how we do that. So this is out of the handbook. It shows band noise versus frequency for residential, and that's the solid line, and it's probably worse than that now. The dashed line is rural, and that's where I am right now, and that's actually quite accurate. But in my case, quiet rural exists in other directions. My noisiest direction is towards the Caribbean, and the quietest is towards JA. So I actually do see that dotted line. I do see that at this QTH. So here's some numbers off the graph. And what I want to emphasize is the difference in band noise between 160 meters and 10 meters is more than 30 dB. So those first three numbers are at night, the 20, 15, and 10 during the day. And this data is with an omnidirectional antenna. And as I say, if you've got any kind of directivity, you're working in a quieter direction, that's to your advantage. So here's something I did actually 10 years ago, but it hasn't changed. I did this for Gerald at Flex. He wanted to see what band noise is like. It was kind of noisy in Austin. So I measured the band noise on 20, 15, and 10 in all directions around the compass. And the ones I've highlighted in red are the noisiest direction, and that's pretty much for me always towards the Caribbean, about southeast. And then you compare those numbers to that graph, and they're within 1 or 2 dB. So that gives you an idea what it really is. That graph is quite accurate. So if in doubt, turn on the preamp? No. I was at Contest University a few years ago, and one of the gentlemen came up after my talk and said, well, I look in my review in QST, and the most sensitive is with preamp 2 on, so I leave it on all the time. Well, that's just craziness. You only want to use it if you need it. Otherwise, you're stressing the radio. It was surprising that the most recent ARRL DX sideband contest this year, I just did a 10-meter activation, and normally on 10 meters, I'd be running preamp 1. And I actually never ran preamp 1 except for about an hour when I was running JAs, and there were a bunch of QRP stations calling me. So that was the case. Even on 10 meters, I didn't need the preamp, which was amazing. And then often people will say, well, why would I want to run the attenuator? And that somewhat depends on the radio. If you have a Flex or an Apache, you have a way to adjust the AGC threshold independently. But on the other brands, you need to use your attenuator. And I like to have the AGC not running on band noise. That just makes it tiring because everything, when no one's talking and there's no CW for an instant, I don't want to hear band noise as loud as what I'm listening, what I'm trying to copy. So just consider a preamp as a tool, an attenuator as a tool, and you use the right tool when you need it. In the case of the 7300, it only has a 20 dB attenuator that works on 160, but otherwise just use the RF gain because it really attenuates in about the same place right at the front end. So here's this antenna noise gain. The one thing I'd really like you to try, all you need is a meter with a dB scale, an analog meter, not a digital meter, an analog meter. It could be a 630 NA or a Simpson 260 or who knows. Any meter has got a dB scale. And we're going to want to find out how much difference there is between the noise coming out of the radio with a dummy load. So like hook a dummy load up on an antenna switch or spare port on your transceiver. And we want to know how much noise is coming out of the radio. You can do this in the CW mode, sideband mode, you get the same answer. So you hook up this voltmeter up to your speaker and you set the volume when you're hooked up the dummy load to say -10 on this dB scale. And then you switch to your antenna, dead spot in the band, of course. And you want to know how much did the noise go up? Well, let's look at 10 meters here. It went only at 3 dB from the dummy load to the antenna with no preamp. That meant the receiver is contributing half the noise. Well, we don't want that. So then in this case, this happened to be a Pro 3. I went to preamp 1, and the difference between the dummy load and the antenna on 10 meters was almost 10 dB, and that's great. So you don't need any more preamp gain than that in this case. But now 6 meters, totally different. And really, I've never had a rig yet on 6 meters that I didn't need a preamp in the country, of course. So it was preamp with no preamp, switching between the dummy load and the antenna. The noise only went up 1 dB. You can hardly hear that. You can measure it, but really it's almost impossible to hear that. But preamp 1 only gave me 4.5 dB increase. And that would mean the receiver's contributing about 1/3 of the noise. And again, you don't want that. But in this case, preamp 2, almost 10 dB, great. So once you've done this with a meter once or twice, you can do this by ear. And you're just like, well, let's give it a check. Do I really have the receiver set up right, or something didn't go wrong with my antenna? And you can by ear say, okay, that was plenty of noise gain. I'm great. So that just, you don't have to get your meter out on a regular basis. So here's where I am today, out here in the country. Yeah, I kind of go overboard on antennas. Everything's monoband, but the directivity is astounding. Since I have two Yagis in 10, 15, and 20 in a contest, maybe I've got the 3 elements pointed to the Caribbean, the 4 or 5 elements pointed to JA or to Europe or wherever, and it's like 2 different bands. The directivity is just astounding in how it reduces QRM. So if you can, a tri-bander, big improvement over a vertical. One thing I want to caution, I just learned this year at Contest University from Frank Donovan, W3LPL, and he's one of the big multi-multis like K3LR. And he said if you've got more than one tower, you don't want tri-banders on both towers. Now, he's got lots of towers and lots of monobanders, but they can interfere with each other. And I'd heard some information about that in the past, but this was really like cut and dried. You don't want 2 towers or 3 towers always multi-band antennas on it because they interfere with each other. If you want to discuss this with Frank, Frank said he's had this email address forever, Donovan F, or Frank Donovan, Donovan F at aerols.com. And I'll send a PDF of this presentation so your club can have a copy of it. If anybody wants, Frank's the expert on antennas. So just a quick break here. That's the end of, we'll call it the technical part. The next will be discussing radios that are for sale today. Does anybody that's watching right now have a question about the technical part? If so, ask away and we'll go from there.
Go ahead. I was wondering, you showed some measurements on the 5000 D delta. Is the 5000 MP the same?
Yes, it is. It's just the difference is just the PA and the external power supply.
Thank you.
Anybody else? I should probably see
Okay.
if any. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I'll head on. So there was 2 main architectures today. We've got the superhet, like a 890S from Kenwood, or the direct sampling, which we looked at 6 of them. And most everything today has an LCD screen. It's either a computer and you're running your radio with a computer, or it's got an internal computer. So that's what we mostly have. Flex runs on a Windows environment or an Apple environment. The Apache runs just on Windows. One thing about Windows is, as you probably found out, if you're running your radio with a computer, is Windows updates can cause havoc. In my shack here, about 60 feet from where I'm sitting, I'm still running Windows 7. Guess what? No updates. I love it. But most of us are probably on Windows 10 or Windows 11. So they're not real-time operating systems, so I don't recommend you be multitasking if you're really in something important like a contest and you're trying to use the same computer to maybe look at spots. That can cause problems. So if possible, run your computer if it's a computer-controlled radio, and run your radio if it's computer-controlled, and just dedicate that computer to that, and maybe doing your logging and something else. But how you interface to your radio, what works for you may not work for your friend or for me, and what I like doesn't mean anything. It's how does it work for you? Because the radios are so good today that the differences are not the lab numbers out of that, like top 25, but just how does this radio play? So here's the ones we're going to look at that come out in the last 3 years. And the little surprising is the K4D with the tuner, because it's an option and not an option in the others, is almost $6,500. But then we've got a lot of radios here in the between 1 and 2,000 range. And just recently, the 710 without the extra speaker, they call that the 710 Field. It's only $900 at HRO. Astounding. The one with the extra speakers, an extra $100. The FTDX 10's now gone up again to $1,500, but you've got quite a list there between $1,500 and $900 now. Your choices are just amazing for your, you could say, entry-level radios or ones that you're going to use the rest of your life. I do have information on some of the others, but from a price standpoint, you see the flagship radios are now pretty much between $3,000 and $4,000. So Flex. Well, Flex is interesting. They've had military contacts twice. When the first one ended in the development of the 6700. And then in the last 2 and 3 years, they've been real busy with that. So they haven't had a lot of changes for the amateurs. But that contract's wrapping up, not quite over yet. In the last 5 years, I'd say they did put their focus on remote operation and contesting. Not much has changed as far as digital signal processing. So hopefully they'll be doing some more work on that once the military contract winds down. But there are some bugs in the Flex software. It's been around for a long time, but they have a very loyal customer base, very helpful web reflectors that help the users. It's a little concerning to me that they don't publish a schematic or any documentation, even though I probably am not going to fix a radio with all these surface mount components, but I really like to have that option. So there's no schematics from Flex. The current models are shipping again in the last couple of months, so that's great for them, of course. The Maestro, which is like an external unit that has a tablet in it and you can run it remotely from your kitchen or your hotel room, that's still not shipping. Hopefully it'll ship fourth quarter. Apache, probably not the biggest percentage people use this, but they've got some bleeding edge technology in the software. So their noise blanking and noise reduction is probably bar none. They also the only one at the moment that have pre-distortion, which reduces your splatter on sideband dramatically. Right now, Elecraft says they'll have pre-distortion sometime for the K4. The Flex has talked about pre-distortion for over 10 years, still not shipping that. ICOM has talked about pre-distortion with their PW2 amplifier. That hasn't shipped, but they say the 7610, with or without the amplifier, will have pre-distortion. Again, it's vaporware until it happens, but if we could get Apache, Flex, Elecraft, and ICOM all to have pre-distortion, we could clean up the sideband splatter a lot. That if you, assuming you don't then overdrive your amplifiers, your linear amplifiers. They're not linear if they're flat topping. Don't consider the pre-distortion called pure signal in Apache plug and play, or even the radio itself. It's fairly complicated. They've got a zillion things you can click on in the menu. A lot of them, I don't even know what they do. So if you're new to HF, or maybe you've been a tech and now you've got a general license, I don't recommend that your first transceiver be computer controlled. Get something that's standalone, 100-watt rig, and so you can take it out of the box, power, a microphone, and an antenna, and you're on the air. Later on, the radios that are run with computers, maybe something to look at, but I would say for your first HF, just keep it simple. The Apache are made out of Australia, and the software is all written open source. Warren Pratt, NR0V, that lives in Loveland, Colorado, just about 40 miles north of me, writes all the DSP code, the pre-distortion pure signal code. And so all sorts of people contribute to how this radio works. The 7300, and that's been out now for 7 years, but I'm putting this in here because it was sort of a game changer. It was the first time we had a relatively inexpensive, when it came out, $1,500, direct sampling with knobs, and they've sold more than 50,000 of them in the USA and Canada, and more overseas. I just don't have the numbers. It's hard to get on the air today on sideband and not run into a 7300. Good dynamic range. It operates pretty much like the rest of the ICOM radios. The ergonomics are quite good. I like the band scope a lot. one thing is they all work about the same: 7300, 7610, 9700. That's the VHF UHF rig, 100 watts on 2 meters, and the 705, which I'll mention separately. That is not a 100-watt rig, though. That's a QRP rig. And in a contest, at least for me as a search and pounce operator, in other words, I'm listening for guys calling CQ on sideband or CW, I want the band scope to recenter once I've tuned to the edge of it. And that's important to me as a search and pounce operator. The 710, now this was Yaesu's first direct sampling, because up till now, like the 101D, the 101MP, and the 10, super hit, roofing filters, excellent performance, great improvements in many aspects compared to years ago for Yaesu. But now we've got, in effect, 2 versions of the 710, and the $1,500 FTDX10 is back up in price, but they both perform very well. And but I wish the band scope worked better as far as recentering. It does not. I operated the 10 and the 710 for 3 months last year, from October through December, in multiple contests, and I found that there's some aspects of the display and how it works is slows me down. But if you're just going to call CQ, probably not an issue. The 10 is just a hair below in lab numbers of the 101D. It's got different ergonomics than the 10. So the interface is the same. All the Yaesus pretty much work the same way. But it is a classic superhet with a hybrid, meaning it's got direct sampling display and it's got roofing filters. Both of the 710 and the 10 have an audio peak filter for CW. The ICOM 7300 does not. For the contest last fall, I ran it in several, and then in the Stu Perry contest on 160 CW near the end of the month in December, I just ran the 10 because it was easier for me to adjust the bandwidth on CW and the IF shift on CW, which also work on sideband, by the way, than with the 10, which I didn't have as much flexibility. However, the ergonomics are quite different between those two. So if you're sitting down in front of a 10 and a 710, it's almost like they were designed by 2 different companies. With the 10, you've got dual concentric knobs for the bandwidth and shift. On the 710, I can't select and memorize a separate IF shift with 2 different sideband bandwidths, which I find annoying because I want to have a different shift for 2.1 than I might have for a 2.8. The volume control on the FTDX10s on the left side of the tuning knob, and if you're right-handed, you bump the tuning knob, unless you be careful. The 710, they put the volume control to the right side of the tuning knob, which for most people that are right-handed works better. And again, I say all the Yaesus pretty much work the same as far as the scopes and the menu system. The 590S, well, you know, that was kind of the best bang for the buck for a very long time. The SG came out in 2014. The S came out in 2010. It doesn't have a band scope. Everything today does. But if you've got a dongle, and particularly with the SG, it's easy to hook up and run a scope on your computer. Reasonable price in the used market. I've seen it for like $600. Interface is pretty simple. And back when they were coming out years ago now, I ran the S, and next year the SG, and one time the 10 Tech is the same time as the SG. So that's what I do, is I have multiple operating positions here at this contest station. So when I was comparing these 2 Yaesus, I tore down the radios that were normally at operating position 1 and 2 and ran the Yaesus. And then I had my reference radio for operating position 3 if something funny came up. So that's how I happen to do I don't just like use it for a day. I use the Yaesus, for instance, for 3 months. And that was helpful. Is Kenwood going to come out with a new rig this year? Probably not next year, we hope. The 590's been out a long time. The 890S, which I've owned that also, came out in 2018. Personally, the 890S waterfall and band scope are the best. And the FTDX 10 and etc. aren't as easy to use from the standpoint of search and pounce. The Kenwood TS2000 was discontinued quite some time ago. That was a DC to light radio, 160 through say 70 centimeters, or if it had a module for 23 centimeters. But there was supposed to be some replacements for the TS2000, and it hasn't happened. At Dayton this year, they did announce a new walkie-talkie. I don't know if it's shipped. It may not even ship till the beginning of next year. But we'll hope that Kenwood stays in the market because they've always been known for good transmit audio, good receive audio, good ergonomics. So we just have to keep our eyes open. 10 watts in a battery. Summits and parks on the air. I assume that most people, unless you're operating mobile, are not going to be hauling a 100-watt rig up a mountaintop. So the 705 is quite an interesting radio. It covers 160 meters through 70 centimeters. I ran one for 3 months. I wasn't running QRP. I did drive an amplifier, but I ran it in contests, but the receiver just worked as well as the other ICOMs. It's good for sideband, CW, FM, digital, FT8 with a laptop, of course. And they even have a companion tuner. It's battery operated. It has like latching relays or something like that. It's a little pricey, but it works much like the AH4 that's been out for decades that I use with my mobile. So you can have a 23-foot piece of wire and maybe a radial on the ground, and work 40 meters through 6 meters with that AH705 tuner. Push a button, tune in seconds, and you cover those bands. New Year's Eve of this, New Year's Day of this year, I was on the air from here and was working a 705 at a Parks on the Air up in the mountains. It was 100 miles away. He was on 2 meters. He had a 3-element Yagi, and he was S9. It was like sitting in my shack. So this little 705 is quite a deal. Here's what it looks like. It only weighs 2.4 pounds. A 7300 is 9.3, but it pretty much looks like the other ICOMs. It's even got a speaker there on the front. You might want to use earphones. So it does work much like all the other ICOMs. I didn't use all the VHF features. I'd say the ergonomics are like all the others. Certainly there's differences because it covers modes on VHF and UHF that aren't on HF, but they pretty much work the same. And the tuning recenters properly, just like the 7300 of the others. The K4. Much of the K4 firmware was ported over to the K4, meaning they took the firmware and reused it, and then had to make some updates. Lots of improvements in the last 2 years. I haven't used a K4 since December of 21, and that was very early in the development of the firmware, so it's gotten a lot better. There are beta releases that often have bugs, so I think they finally beta 33.34 finally went production. So that's that until the next beta comes out. So the owners are in effect beta operators and beta testers. It's kind of expensive, $64.80 with the tuner. Price increased 9% in April. They've offered some $200 discounts at some of the Hamfests. We're still waiting for the HD model. That means the one that would have a super het card added to the direct sampling radio, so that it would have a roofing filter on CW in particular. It would also have it for sideband. It won't have it for AM. You'd have to use the direct sampling mode for AM, no problem. They're still talking about pre-distortion and transverters. When we'll see them, I don't know. Some scuttlebutt, maybe the transverters will be out at the end of the year, I don't know. Very loyal customer base. I'd say probably bulk of the K4 owners were K3 owners. Excellent reflector support, particularly from Bob and N6TV. One oddball thing with the K4 is if you've got a single antenna, let's say a tri-bander for 2015 and 10, you've got the dual receiver model, and you're running, let's say you're on the air on 20 meters and you want to see if 10's open on your tri-bander, but you can't do that. So that's a problem. I don't understand why they did it. And from a decision standpoint, I know what they did, but with other rigs, like with the 7610, if I'm on 20, I can listen on 10 or 6. If I'm on 160, I can listen on 6. So you can't do that because the transmit low pass filter is in the circuit on receive. So you can't listen on 10 on the same antenna. Now, if you got separate antennas, no problem. Just a comparison of the 7610 to the 7300, because I get this question all the time. Should I upgrade? What if I want to run SO2R, etc.? So the 7610 that costs more than 3 times the price of the 7300, no noisy relays in the TR switching, and you can key your amp with a FET, so it doesn't have to have a relay for that, assuming you've got a modern amp. The audio peak filter exists in the 7610, does not exist in the 7300. That's a CW thing. You've got dual receivers, of course, in the 7610, and more buttons, and buttons for each band instead of having used the LCD screen. But once you're on the band, you're on the band. It does have 2 transmit antenna ports, 1 receive port for like a beverage, and you can hook up an external monitor. I don't use an external monitor, even with the little 7300 or the 9700 or the R8600 receiver. I wear bifocals and it works fine, but a lot of people like really big monitors. Go for it. Quieter fan for sure. Now, since it does have dual receivers, if you want a separate tuning knob, you buy their RC28 that was really initially meant for remote operation with their software, but most of us that want to be able to easily tune the second receiver, it's like $300, but the flex knob is the same price about as the Elecraft knob. So all these extra knobs are kind of pricey, but useful. So what should we consider? Well, operator fatigue is made worse if the receiver has, the audio has a problem or the AGC doesn't work right. And if you're operating for hours at a time, DXing, contesting, fatigue is an issue and you want to minimize that. So the noise blanker, the noise reduction, if you live in town, that may be the biggest problem. You might pick the radio that has the best noise mitigation, but again, that's hard to measure in the lab. Your noise isn't the same as my noise. So you may have to just guess. Flex probably is the best for remote. Unfortunately, they've had some problems a few weeks ago where the remote server was down and sometimes you couldn't even use your radio in your shack. But most of the time it works. Apache has the pure signal. As I mentioned, we've got 3 other companies that are talked about it, and it would be so nice if that really becomes reality. And do you want an internal computer or an external computer, or you want no computer? That's your choice. The ergonomics can be frustrating. That's the one thing, like with the FTDX10, the volume control is in the wrong place for a right-handed operator. The 710 is on the right place. Do you want to run your computer and your radio together, or you just want to use your computer for logging? I just use a computer for logging, but that's just my choice. Is the firmware updated? I mean, today, no one writes firmware that's perfect, software that's perfect. So is it updated? Did they fix the bugs, or is it kind of orphaned later? What about warranty service? Now, this is a big deal. I ran into this with my Kenwood 990 and the 890, and the service center in Virginia was really good, but that got shut down. The one in California was terrible. I had friends that had their radios in there for 3 or 4 months, but now they've got a company out of New York that's doing a good job. So service is important. And is it supported after the radio goes out of production? Can you get parts? Or can they even fix it if you send it back to the factory? So the bottom line, the last thing today is, do you enjoy using your radio? Whether you're DXing, contesting, rag chewing, FT8, whatever it is, it should be fun. This is a hobby. If you struggle with your radio, if it's like not fun because it's too much work, try something else that works better for you. What works for me may not work for you and vice versa. So at the end of the day, you should be able to say, I'm shutting down QRT and I had fun. Here's my email address. If you have any questions, rob@nc0b.com. I'll send your club a PDF, and I'm certainly open for any kind of questions. And I'll stop sharing my screen and back to you guys.
There we go. Yeah. Other thumbnails. There it is. Okay, oh, we got Carl out here too, okay. So any of you guys out there
Get back
on,
to Rob. Get down to Rob.
pardon me,
Get back to Rob. I'll go back to Rob.
what about
You can back on the screen.
putting back on the screen?
Yes, so you can ask questions.
There, okay, now we got two guys on the screen.
So anyway, any questions after that?
Yeah, you mentioned pretty good, in fact, a damn good rundown of the modern radios. I got an old great TR7 that I love. It's great audio, great, easy to operate, someone like that. And I, of course, they had a Collins back in the day, and so on, outstanding for the day. And how do those radios compare to today's rigs? I still love that rig.
Well, the TR7 and the R7, of course, are on my website as our, the R4B, the R4C, the TR4, etc. If you're in a CW pileup, then the modern, either the down conversion superheads like a 590S will do better in those really bad conditions. The other thing is that's interesting is if you had a Collins or a C-line and they weren't synthesized, if you had them back in the day when they'd go to field day, you didn't have transmit noise issues. But now a lot of the radios have a lot of transmitted noise, which for the most part, if you got nobody closer than a few miles away, not much of a problem. But for field day, it's a big deal. So it just depends on what radio works. Now, of course, there's a lot of fans of the TR7. I ran one for years. I had a speech processor for it. But its dynamic range, it's on the list. It's on the web. So it isn't going to be ideal in the worst case CW pileup, but for sideband, no problems at all.
Well, my only comment, I have a Bellcraft K3 and the great TR7. Side by side, the audio on the Drake is way over the audio understandability of the K3. That's my personal opinion, in my years at least.
Well, that's interesting because, and I agree with you. I'm going to be giving a presentation at YCCC this year, and as a matter of fact, within the month. And in 2008, before Zoom, I was flown into Boston and gave a presentation at YCCC. And on Monday, before the weekend, I contacted Ellicraft, and the K3 basically came out early 2008. And I thought the audio was terrible. And so I looked at it on a spectrum analyzer, an audio spectrum analyzer, and like the distortion was bad. So I called up Wayne and I said on Monday before YCCC and said, I'm going to be talking about how bad your audio is in the K3. Now it improved over time, but it still never got to the point where it's like you say, the TR7 was better. So Ellicraft spent 3 days in the lab and then contacted me and sent me some screenshots saying, okay, we fixed it. Well, they did improve it, no question. But I just wondered, how did it ever get out the door sounding as bad as it did? But there's a case where, Kenwood's always really had good receive audio and transmit too. But it's just amazing that it seems like some engineers design a product and they don't have hi-fi ears, and they don't hear distortion or they don't hear hiss or other kinds of noise. So it's not a given that a radio is going to sound good to some of us that are more critical on the receive side.
Well, thank you. I'm glad that you confirmed that it wasn't just my ears. And
No.
another thing, Wayne Burdick is a CW guy, and I assume he listened to CW more than he did the sideband or anything else on the band. But thank you. It makes me feel better about my mental acuity, I guess. Thank you.
Well, even the K3 on CW, when it came out, the harmonic distortion was bad. So I don't know why Wayne didn't complain about that, because if you looked at it with a spectrum analyzer, the harmonics were bad. And so it wasn't a clean note.
Okay.
Anybody else?
Yeah, Rob, this is
Yeah.
John, W3ML. Just wanted to point out that in the last week, ICOM has come out and said they have no parts to repair the 7610 if your main board goes out.
Okay,
They're getting parts.
Okay, so here's what happened. There was a fire in Japan in 2020, and some chips that ICOM used became unavailable. And so the serial numbers that started with 12 had the original 3 or 4 years, however many, of that board. And then when they couldn't get the chips anymore, they had to use different chips. So they had to, we'll call it roll the board. And so the serial numbers that start with 22 instead of 12 have that different main board. I had heard, certainly there's been discussions on the reflectors about that. So the case would be if the chip that was used originally and not available because of the fire is no longer available again, then they'd have to replace the main board, which probably wouldn't be economical. So that is the problem with our integrated circuits are so complex, and there's not always multiple sources. Now, a lot of companies, like say the military or even computers, that they'll have multiply sourced for a given chip. But obviously that's not the case, and sad to hear that. Now, I've owned 3 of the 7610s, and 2 of them from day one. I've never had the slightest problem. So it's probably not a significant issue, but it's not insignificant. So yeah, it's a sad deal that the company that had the fire isn't willing to go back and produce some of the chips that they were selling 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago.
I purchased mine in Dayton right after they came out. And I've been real lucky because I got no problem with the screen or any of that.
Me neither.
Me neither.
Yeah, and 2 of mine are the original screen, no trouble, and the other one's 2 years newer and no trouble with it either.
Do you think ICON's got any ideas about a new radio, somewhat between the 7610 and the 7851?
Obviously, I don't know. As long as sales are brisk, I assume not. You say, because there's going to be a 7620. I wouldn't know what I'd add that would be worth it. The fact that every 7610 can take a firmware update and have pre-distortion sometime this year, we're promised, and I hope it happens, because the PW2, they're going to not do it until the PW2 ships. So that's sort of silly, because they've said the pre-distortion is going to be working the radio barefoot. Well, they'll ship the software, but they haven't. So maybe they'll do it before December. I don't know. It's not obvious who's going to come out with the next new rig. Maybe Flex. We've got, the K4 is not going to be replaced anytime in the next 10 years or 5 years or whatever. Yaesu has had many new rigs here in the last few years, particularly with the 710 and the 10. And the prices have come down on all the Yaesu products. When I just checked prices yesterday on HRO, all the ones that were in my chart there on pricing came down a couple $100. Apache is in transition right now. The 7000 DLE is no longer being made, and the Generation 2 I don't think are shipping yet. So the Generation 2, that'll be new. And what else? We've got Kenwood. Well, who knows if they'll have something besides the 890. And I love the 890, but it's only a single receiver. Most of the time, I don't ever use my second receiver. I bet 5 times a year. We got the expedition this weekend. I think some island is on the air this weekend for the next week or 2. Yes, Swain Island. That's right. So I'll use the second receiver, but most of the time I don't use it. You wonder if the 7851 market isn't saturated. So would they be able to have a $9,000 radio that would supplant the 7851? I mean, how many people are today it can afford and choose to buy a 7851 don't have it? I would assume the sales are rather low.
Rob, I got a question, N9RD, Peter.
Yeah.
I have an 857D. Okay, I had it in the car for the last 20 years practically since it came out. Never had a problem with it other than the display, but everybody has that. Is there anything on the market that will ever replace that? with, 160 through 70 centimeters. There's nothing available right now.
For mobile?
Well, mobile at home or something like this, but it's just a mobile radio that I use.
Right. I'm trying to think. I guess there isn't. I keep telling ICOM they had the 706 that was the Mobile King, and then the 7000, which I had briefly, and that was 160 through 70 centimeters. And they kind of owned that market. And of course, it was perfectly fine to use as a base station. And they've come out with this 910, which is 2 meters through 10 gigahertz. That's $3,500. So why are they ignoring that market that you just mentioned? 160 through 70 centimeters, 100 watts on at least up through 6, maybe 50 watts on 2, and 35 watts on 70. I mean, that market's wide open. There's nobody sort of playing that market. And I don't understand why.
Yeah, I can't figure it out either because there's a need for it. It's nice to be able to jump on any band while you're mobile or so, and you don't have to have a second radio. Now then maybe they have to figure it out. If they sell 2 radios, it's more profitable.
Isn't that what the ICOM 990 is? Or is that too old? Is 160 through 440?
I don't know. I mean, ICOM had a 7410 and a Pro and a 746 Pro. Now, 746 Pro I thought went from 160 to at least 2 meters, and I think that maybe it even had 70 centimeters. I'm not sure. And the 7410 did that include 2 meters too? I forget.
I think it did.
Yeah, I think it did too. So, but that that product doesn't exist today. But I mean the 705 now it's only 10 watts, but it covers 160 through 70 centimeters. So this wouldn't be rocket science to come out with some new model that's 100 watts, removable head like the 706 and this IC 7000 for mobile guys, or you snap it on in the base station. And if you can make a 705, which is a really cute radio, I loved using it. It's 10 watts. It isn't like ICOM couldn't come out with what you're asking for.
Okay. Something else, I have a question too. I have a lot of line noise, especially on 6 meters and so on. That MFJ makes a unit that reduces the noise. Opposed to, you put it in and then it turns the phase 180 degrees and supposedly reduces line noise. Have you got any idea that works really?
I haven't used one, but I know people that have. Now, if the line noise is coming from one direction, you obviously have to have a sense antenna for the device and your main antenna, and then you have to combine the signals. And like you say, you can put an amplitude and phase adjustable. And I think doesn't DX Engineering also have something like that? But if you've got noise from multiple directions, it doesn't work. So that's one thing to consider. The Apache does have some pretty amazing noise mitigation, and it doesn't do magic things on everybody's noise. There are audio clips up on my website, and I'll send an email with that link to your club that you can listen to what's possible with the Apache. I mean, this demonstration that Warren Pratt, NR0V, did at Tapper about 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago at Dayton, it knocked you off your chair. You could hardly hear anything, and then they switched on all the noise mitigation. It was almost like they were sitting in the room with a little bit of waviness to it. So there's the area that all these people now, every radio's really got software today. There's no such thing in the term SDR, software defined radio, as far as I'm concerned, applies to everything in some way or another. Everything's got firmware updates. So that's an area that's wide open for other people to write software besides Warren Pratt.
Okay, well, I have a 6-element beam on 6 meters, so my noise is directive. It comes from the front, usually nothing from the side or behind. But the antenna that MFJ supplies is a a wire or whatever else they have on the second antenna to get the 180-degree signal. Wouldn't it, if I pick up something off of the back itself, a different type of noise, that shouldn't work then?
Yeah, what you might consider is, so you've got a 6-element. Does your mast on your tower have space for a 3-element Yagi below your 6-element Yagi that could be 10 feet apart or something like that, and then use that as your noise antenna and try to phase those? Would that work?
I could try that. That might be a good idea.
Yeah, I think that it'd be worth a shot. I mean, if you've got the mast space, you certainly don't want the two antennas 2 feet apart, but if you can get them 6 to 10 feet apart, I'd really try it. And it doesn't have to be, even 2 elements might work.
Rob,
Yeah.
I'm a CW operator. I've got a K4D. I've got a neighbor who's likewise a CW operator. He's just a smidgen under 1.5 miles from me. And unless his antenna is pointed away from me, he's got a Yagi. I've got just a long wire. He's typically 60/9 here, which is as high as my radio reads. But the other day I was on 17 meters and I was having a QSO and I saw on my scope a very strong signal. And it turns out it was my neighbor, and he was 1.5 kilohertz away from me. And he and I exchanged emails later. Neither one of us was bothering the other. He was on his K4D. He also has 7851, which is a little cleaner. But also at the same time on the band, I saw a signal that was 25 dB over 9, and he was 3 times as wide down at the lower range of his skirts, but he was still really wide. So one of my big concerns is cleanliness of the CW transmitted signal, and there still seems to be too much variation in that, I think.
Okay, I saw your post on the reflector, by the way, so I knew your story. And well, that's what, if you were at Dayton this year, maybe you saw a few people walking around, or we're at the AWR booth, and something called Clean Signal Initiative.
Right.
Now, I wrote an article for QST that was, I think, November of 2019, I think it was, and they were discussing. They originally said, well, write an article about transmit composite noise. And I said, well, we got more noise than that. We got key click noise, sideband splatter noise, and composite noise. And so that's what, and I'm on this group with ARRL, and we just had our last meeting yesterday dealing with the plan to introduce to the amateur community and the OEMs a incentive to clean up the transmitters, because right now the receivers are so good, it's silly for OEMs to spend any more time and money making the receivers 112 dB instead of 110 or 105. We don't need that. We need cleaner transmitters. Now, one thing that will help, if your rig lets you adjust the rise time, pick the slowest rise time in the menu. Unfortunately, like Kenwood lets you pick 1 millisecond. That's just nuts. And ICOM lets you pick 2 milliseconds, and that's also nuts. You really want to shoot for 6. And if it has 8, maybe pick 8, because that affects the bandwidth. And there's no question. I mean, look at the older Yaesu rigs. They were notorious for key clicks. W8JI complained upside down and sideways about key clicks on the Yaesu stuff. That's no longer a problem. But so check your rise time. Usually in reality, it's somewhat faster than menu, but pick the slowest one in the menu. And also, don't let anything hot switch. Do you do QSK or you just do semi-break-in?
I do QSK. My friend does not.
Okay.
We better start wrapping it up here, but any other questions out there of Rob? We got nobody here. Anybody out there on Zoom land? Who we got?
Yeah, it's Tom, W8FIB. Yeah, I just noticed there, said the K4Ds are not available yet. Is that right?
The HD is not yet available. The K4D is available.
The HD is the one that would make it a super hit.
Okay, that's the one that's not available.
Right. It would be like a K3 from the standpoint of having roofing filters, particularly for CW.
Yeah. Okay, I didn't catch that.
Yeah, sorry, I should have made that more clear. So the HD has been shipping mostly, I don't know, I bet 95% of the K400s have the D. Very few have the non-D.
Okay, well, I'm gonna stop the recording now. I don't think we need to record anymore. To answer Tom was the one that brought up that it would be good to have the recording, and Fellow Locally is going to put it out as a YouTube. As soon as I have all the information as to where to find it and so forth, I'll get it out to everybody. But thank you, everybody, and Rob, thank you tremendous amount. Great.
Amen.
Great.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Good job.
Enjoyed it, and if you have any of you are at Xena next year, let us. If you see me, wave at me or shake my hand.
Okay, great.
All right, 73.
Yeah.
73.
Great.